My name is Emilia Sánchez González. I'm a recent graduate from the Master of Arts World Heritage Studies at Brandenburg University of Technology in Cottbus, Germany. I have a background in tourism management with focus on communication and languages, and my professional mission is to communicate the value of culture as a medium for interdisciplinary learning, peace building, and sustainability. My interests include intangible cultural heritage, transcultural practices and identities, decolonial studies, heritage interpretation, museum education, and Asia-Latin America relations. So before I start, I want to recognize the fantastic work of the ACMC committee planning this conference, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in it, share some of my viewpoints, and network with peers. Moving on to my presentation, the topic is on resilience, amplifying marginalized voices in the arts and cultural sector, experiences from indigenous communities in Mexico. First, I will provide you with a bullet point overview of the structure of my presentation. I will give a brief introduction of my motives for working in pro of marginalized voices in the arts and cultural sector. Then, for my master thesis, I recently conducted research on internal colonialist normative ideas within a specific type of higher education institution in Mexico that is aimed at indigenous people. I will rely on this case study of Intercultural Universities in Mexico to highlight institutional practices that have or have not worked in cultural education and reflect on the concepts of power relations, dialogues of knowledge, and plurality. I consider these findings useful to raise awareness of underlying ideologies that often create barriers for equal representation in the arts and cultural sector. Then I will conclude with alternative paths to be explored and a nudge to the themes of reimagining and reinterpreting. Okay, so in current times, we are witnessing a polarized approach to the long-time issue of racism. The enhanced cultural awakening of people and institutions to improve their policies and practices with initiatives all over the world for cultural diversity, women's rights, and anti-racism is challenged constantly by an increase in xenophobic ideas. Arts and culture institutions can play invaluable roles in visualizing the struggles of these marginalized voices and create spaces for dialogue and resilience. On this frontier, thankfully, we've also seen some progress. We can see on the next slide, such as these initiatives for diversifying collections and staff in the museum, and research on imperialist and discriminatory practices in cultural management. However, this is just the beginning. To become better allies to this endeavor, a rethinking process of the relationships between institutions and marginalized groups is paramount. Now, let's go to the case study. Unequal access to quality higher education in Mexico is not a new problem. Nationwide, there is a struggle to improve the possibilities for academic preparation past the elementary and secondary levels among the economically disadvantaged sectors of the population, primarily those living in rural areas and indigenous peoples. The Intercultural University model was created to address these disadvantages and rectify previous attempts at responding to the indigenous claims for quality education. At present, it's been 17 years since the opening of the first Intercultural University, of which we can currently count 11, as you can see on the map. It appears that the initiative has not managed to fulfill the expectations it set at its creation. We can find many explanations for this lack of success in the implementation of the intercultural model. Poor administration, shortage of support granted by the state, and governmental limitations on the autonomy of the individual universities. All of this contribute to creating a low quality model that does not resemble the promised model. So beyond these administrative issues, however, scholars have widely held a critique that the fundamental problems of the intercultural model have its roots more in an ideological standing. And here is where my research comes in. The intercultural model, in brief, we can say that it meant to use cultural interaction approach in formal education to solve the problems of racism in the Mexican population and empower indigenous peoples. This aim goes hand in hand with increasing representation of indigenous voices in all sectors, including arts and culture, and giving more opportunities for marginalized voices to play active roles in the country. Here they claim that they also include people in rural areas who are not necessarily indigenous. For example, by offering careers that incorporate traditional knowledge and indigenous languages, thus preparing indigenous peoples to work as interpreters, manage sustainable tourism in their land, and communicate their artistic and cultural practices to the rest of the Mexican population. Let's go to the next slide. So I aimed my research as a general objective to better understand how do intercultural universities approach indigenous higher education through the ideologies present and absent in their institutional discourses. You can also read my specific objectives here, which are focused on the adaptation of the national discourse to the local contexts, finding if and how issues of internal colonialism, here referred to as issues of domination and exploitation-based social problematics, are referred, and how are they reflected in their discourses, if they are. And finally, to assess the shortcomings and opportunities of intercultural universities as decolonial entities in contemporary contexts. Overall, this should help recognize the normative ideas in educational policies concerning indigenous peoples and overall marginalized voices in other contexts, and take action to overcome these prevailing issues. I chose to do this by doing a qualitative content analysis of the mission statements of the official model and of the 11 different universities within the network. Here you can see a glimpse of the coding process involved, and the program that I used was MaxQDA. So after doing this, the case study helped me realize several things. First, the approach we take to incorporating marginalized voices in a field or a specific project is key to the amount of participation and agency that these voices will have. Often, campaigns follow essentialist and static perceptions of culture that, in pro of cohesion, end up stifling the benefits of plurivocality. In this case study, it was possible to see how an idea, the initial idea of assimilating the marginalized into the predominant culture, evolved for better into a program that sought to increase participation of the marginalized. However, it still kept them out of the decision-making levels. But the idea that the problem had been solved and prematurely celebrating their achievements did not leave much room for a continued self-assessment of their policies, which is something we should always take into account. Because overcoming our blind spots is an ongoing effort. The research also showed that local practices were usually in high compliance with the national scheme. So if there was a fault in the general model, it usually trickled down to the local practices as well, even inadvertently. And this happens in highly centralized systems. If the local actors in the organization already struggle to make their voice heard, how can they advocate for plurivocality from individuals? So on the same line, another finding is that the universities that were created in partnership with local universities or local communities, not just following the national scheme, They showed more critical, dynamic, and dialogical approaches in their missions. Their higher levels of autonomy and connection to the local actors allowed them to adapt practices in a more suitable manner to their particular environments. And they also showed more willingness to incorporate the local communities as active participants in the decision-making process. Finally, the analysis also revealed a latent rhetoric of creating solutions for indigenous peoples from the state's perspective in its position of experts, which is a top-down approach we are very familiar with in the field of culture. This approach failed, of course, to consider the real needs of the local communities, who did not only want to manage their cultural assets in their land, but they wanted the possibility to grow anywhere they chose to, and to acquire the tools and knowledge necessary to join the policy-making level. Okay, so now that we've explored some of the problems, we can talk about solutions. In my research, there were two characteristics that represented the turning point within the network of universities. So the universities that displayed better practices usually had these two characteristics, which are plurality and dialogues of knowledge. So they incorporated these approaches. First, let's make the case for plurality. It is necessary to appreciate the extensive impact of diversity in society. It creates spaces for the study of a wider range of subjects, enriches social interactions, and enhances creative solutions. It also reduces dependency on one sole resource, idea, or group of people, and is hence more sustainable. As an approach, plurality should be a core concept for educational curriculums, in my opinion, whether informal, non-formal, or formal education, which should also support each other. About the people, it should also include teachers, students, and stakeholders alike. And plurality should be seen as an integral part of cultures and identities, because as individuals, we are, so to say, made of different bits and pieces from different cultural practices. So our identities are already plural. The arts and cultural sector can help visualize this plurality by reflecting the historical and current movements of people around the world and the transcultural flows resulting from them, which has been done in, for example, exhibitions about migration. Okay, so what about dialogues of knowledge? What I mean by this is that we need to dare question what we know, what it means to educate and be educated, why are we developing certain projects, exhibitions, seminars, and let ourselves receive input from sources that have traditionally been excluded without feeling the need to grant them legitimacy. So, for example, when working with indigenous communities, we can exchange the idea of traditional for local knowledge, which better addresses the process-focused nature of culture. And it will also help us avoid essentializing culture and acknowledge the natural evolution of cultural practices. I would like to conclude my presentation with a word of caution. The path in cultural acknowledgement and representation lies in change induced by critical analysis. So here, I believe the conference has highlighted the key elements very well. To build resilience, to reimagine, and to reinterpret what we think we know is not an easy task. Before shifts in practice happen, people will gradually need to undertake shifts in consciousness and rethink not only the how, but also the why are things being done a certain way. And this rethinking process should always be followed by action. I think education is a key space for this action. Educational tools for informal and non-formal learning, as well as formal programs, should push us to learn plurality and dialogue and unlearn the idea that there is such a thing as a justified oppression of certain groups. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Please feel free to contact me if you're interested in the topics presented. I'll be very glad to speak with you further, and see you for the Q&A section. Bye.